Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the dusty, sun-baked marketplaces of ancient Sumer, where the world's first written laws weren't just carved in stone. They were enforced with a creativity that would make modern bureaucrats weep with envy. Picture yourself standing in the shadow of a towering ziggurat around 2100 BCE, watching merchants haggle over barley, while temple priests patrol the stalls with the authority to literally end lives over a poorly brewed batch of beer. The air is thick with incense, sweat, and the distinct aroma of fermented grain, while cuneiform tablets scratch out contracts that bind souls as much as silver. You probably won't survive this legal system. One miscalculated trade deal could land you in slavery. And heaven help you if you try to pass off watered-down ale as the good stuff. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always fascinating to see how far these ancient stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself approaching the great market of on a sweltering morning, the kind where the sun hasn't even fully risen, but already promises to turn clay into pottery without a kiln. The first law that would either save your life or end it concerns something you'd never expect to be regulated with lethal precision: beer. In Sumerian society, beer wasn't just a beverage. It was currency, medicine, and divine offering rolled into one frothy package. The Code of Hammurabi, though Babylonian, built upon earlier Sumerian traditions that treated beer quality with the seriousness modern governments reserve for nuclear weapons. Here's where it gets deliciously deadly. If you were a tavern keeper caught diluting beer or charging too much for your brews, the punishment wasn't a fine or temporary closure. Oh no, that would be far too reasonable for a civilization that invented writing just to keep track of who owed what to whom. Instead, you'd be thrown directly into the river. Not metaphorically, literally hurled into the flowing waters to either swim your way to innocence or sink into well-deserved drowning. The logic was beautifully simple. The river gods would judge your guilt or innocence, and if you'd been cheating customers out of proper beer, well, you probably deserved whatever the currents decided. But here's the quirky part that historians love to debate. Some tablets suggest that certain tavern keepers actually learned to swim specifically because of this law, turning what should have been divine judgment into an occupational skill. Imagine putting excellent swimmer due to frequent beer fraud trials on your ancient resume. The mainstream historical consensus holds that these beer laws were primarily about maintaining social order, since taverns served as informal banks, meeting places, and news centers. Control the beer, control the flow of information and commerce. Historians still argue whether the drowning punishment was consistently enforced or more of a deterrent threat. But the tablets are clear about one thing. Beer quality inspectors held positions of tremendous power, essentially walking around with the authority to sentence people to trial by river. These weren't just random officials either. They were often priests or temple appointees, because apparently the gods cared deeply about proper fermentation techniques. You watch as one such inspector approaches a nervous tavern owner, dipping a small clay cup into a large ceramic vessel. The tension in the air is palpable as he takes a measured sip, rolls it around his mouth with the concentration of a modern sommelier, and then either nods approvingly or shakes his head with the finality of a death sentence. The owner's relief or terror tells you everything you need to know about which way the tasting went. The beer laws also created an interesting economic dynamic where tavern keepers became some of the most honest merchants in the entire marketplace, not out of inherent virtue, but because the consequences of dishonesty involved a very real possibility of drowning. This legal innovation accidentally created the world's first consumer protection agency, run by priests who took their beer-tasting duties with religious fervor. As you move deeper into the market, passing the relieved beer seller who just survived his morning inspection, you encounter the next layer of Sumerian commercial law that would make modern agricultural regulators dizzy with its complexity. The sacred sheep pricing regulations. These weren't just any sheep we're talking about, these were temple sheep, animals blessed by priests and dedicated to specific gods, whose market value was determined not by supply and demand, but by divine decree and government mandate. The mainstream historical fact here is that Sumerian temples operated as the world's first centralized banks, controlling vast herds of livestock that served as both religious offerings and economic currency. These institutions weren't just places of worship. They were financial powerhouses that could make or break entire city-states through their control of animal-based wealth. The priests didn't just pray. They calculated interest rates, managed investment portfolios of grain and livestock, and set prices that merchants had to follow or face consequences that made the beer drowning seem like a gentle warning. Here's where it gets wonderfully weird. Certain sheep were assigned specific values based on their astrological birth dates, their wool quality, and even their behavioral patterns during religious ceremonies. A sheep that bleated at the wrong moment during a harvest festival might suddenly find its market value plummeting, while one that stood perfectly still during prayers could see its price triple overnight. Imagine trying to explain that economic model to a modern stock market analyst. Well, you see, the sheep's performance during Tuesday's ritual really boosted investor confidence. But the truly bizarre aspect was the color coding system. White sheep held different values than brown ones, but not consistently. The relative worth fluctuated based on which god was being honored that month, seasonal festivals, and even the dreams reported by the high priest. Historians still argue whether this system was a sophisticated form of planned economy or just elaborate religious theater designed to keep merchants guessing and temple coffers full. You watch as a shepherd approaches a temple official with 3 sheep, their wool gleaming in the morning sun. The official consults a clay tablet covered in cuneiform calculations, mutters what sounds like a prayer, and then announces prices that make absolutely no sense to your modern sensibilities. The largest, healthiest looking sheep is valued lower than a smaller, scruffier one, apparently because the scrappy little guy was born during a lunar eclipse and therefore carries divine favor. The shepherd doesn't argue, he can't afford to. Challenging temple pricing wasn't just bad business, it was borderline blasphemy. These weren't arbitrary rules either. They were backed by centuries of religious tradition and enforced by officials who wielded both spiritual authority and very real economic power. Get on the wrong side of the sheep pricing establishment, and you might find yourself unable to trade in livestock at all, effectively cutting you off from one of the primary forms of wealth in Sumerian society. The quirky detail that makes historians chuckle is that some merchants became expert sheep psychologists, learning to read animal behavior not for agricultural purposes, but to predict their market value. There are tablets describing traders who could spot a temple-worthy sheep from across a crowded marketplace, not because of its wool or health, but because of subtle behavioral cues that suggested divine favor. Talk about niche professional skills. This created a secondary market in sheep training, where clever entrepreneurs would spend weeks conditioning animals to behave properly during religious ceremonies, essentially creating the ancient world's first livestock stage schools. The investment paid off when a well-trained sheep could command prices that reflected its enhanced spiritual resume, rather than just its meat and wool potential. Morning heat intensifies as you witness the daily ritual that every merchant must perform before conducting any serious business, the honesty oath ceremony. This isn't some casual promise or handshake deal. This is a formal swearing before multiple gods that would make modern courtroom proceedings look casual by comparison. You're watching the birth of contract law, enforced not by lawyers and judges, but by divine beings who were believed to actively monitor every commercial transaction. The mainstream historical reality is that Sumerian merchants operated in the world's first truly international trade network, shipping goods from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, but without modern legal frameworks to ensure trust between strangers. The solution was brilliantly simple. Make everyone swear sacred oaths daily, backed by gods who were believed to personally punish oath-breakers with everything from crop failures to mysterious illnesses. These weren't just cultural customs. They were the binding legal foundation that made long-distance commerce possible. Here's the deliciously odd part. Merchants had to swear different oaths depending on what they were selling, to which specific gods, and using particular ritual phrases that couldn't be altered without voiding the spiritual contract. A grain merchant's morning oath was completely different from a textile trader's, and heaven help you if you mixed up the words. There are clay tablets recording disputes where deals fell through not because of price disagreements or quality issues, but because someone stumbled over the ritual phrasing and had to start the entire oath ceremony over again. But the truly quirky detail that makes modern historians smile is the backup oath system. If a merchant forgot his morning oath or performed it incorrectly, he could pay for a priest to perform a corrective ceremony, essentially buying spiritual insurance against divine retribution for oath breaking. This created a thriving side business where priests specialized in emergency oath corrections, like ancient legal consultants who made house calls to fix your divine contract problems. Historians still argue whether these oath ceremonies were genuine religious practice or sophisticated psychological tools designed to encourage honest dealing through social pressure and superstition. The evidence suggests both. Merchants who grew up in the system genuinely believed in divine monitoring, while foreign traders often viewed it as elaborate theater, but participated anyway to access Sumerian markets. You watch as a nervous-looking merchant approaches a small shrine set up in the market center, clutching a clay tablet with his oath written in careful cuneiform. He begins reciting in a voice that carries the weight of absolute belief, naming gods you've never heard of and promising levels of honesty that would make a modern politician burst into laughter. But nobody here is laughing. This is serious business. The kind of serious that determines whether your family eats or starves based on whether the gods believe your promises. The really fascinating aspect is how these oath systems adapted to different types of commerce. Quick, small transactions required shorter oaths, while major deals involving months of credit or international shipping demanded elaborate ceremonies that could take hours to complete properly. The more money involved, the more gods you needed to swear to, creating a sliding scale of divine involvement in human business that was both practical and terrifying. Foreign merchants often hired local oath specialists, priests who would coach them through the proper pronunciations and gestures, because getting it wrong wasn't just embarrassing, it could destroy your reputation and trading relationships permanently. Word traveled fast in ancient commercial networks, and being known as someone who couldn't properly swear an honest oath was basically a career death sentence. As the sun climbs higher and the oath ceremonies conclude, you're drawn to what might be the most viscerally terrifying aspect of Sumerian commercial law: the weights and measures enforcement system. This isn't about gentle fines or business license suspensions. This is about maintaining the integrity of measurement through the very real threat of permanently losing parts of your body that you've grown rather attached to over the years. The mainstream historical fact is that standardized weights and measures were absolutely crucial to Sumerian civilization's economic success. Without reliable standards, trade would collapse into chaos, with every transaction becoming a negotiation not just over price, but over the basic units of measurement. The Sumerians solved this problem by creating official weight standards maintained by temple authorities and enforced through penalties that ensured nobody would risk cheating, because the consequences were immediate, permanent, and visible to everyone in the marketplace. Here's where it gets gruesomely creative. Merchants caught using false scales or weights faced finger amputation, not metaphorical finger pointing for their dishonesty, actual removal of the digits they'd used to manipulate the measuring devices. The logic was poetically brutal. If your fingers had been used to cheat customers, then your fingers had forfeited their right to exist. The punishment fit the crime with a precision that modern legal systems, for all their complexity, rarely achieve. But the quirky detail that fascinates historians is how this system created a bizarre secondary market in prosthetic fingers. Skilled craftsmen developed techniques for creating realistic-looking replacement digits from wood, clay, and even precious metals, allowing reformed cheaters to maintain their dignity while serving as living warnings to other merchants. Some tablets describe elaborate finger-fitting ceremonies where the prosthetics were blessed by priests to ensure they brought better luck than the original, dishonest digits they replaced. You watch as a weights inspector approaches a grain merchant stall, carrying the official temple weights that serve as the absolute standard for all measurements. The merchant's hands visibly tremble as he places his own weights on a balance scale, knowing that any discrepancy could cost him the ability to count his profits on his own fingers. The inspector's job requires the mathematical precision of an accountant combined with the moral authority of a judge and the stomach of an executioner. Historians still argue whether the finger amputation punishment was consistently enforced or served primarily as a deterrent. But the archaeological evidence is clear. Plenty of skeletal remains from Sumerian sites show evidence of deliberate finger removal, and not from accidents or warfare. These weren't random acts of violence. They were surgical procedures performed with legal authority and community approval. The truly fascinating aspect is how merchants adapted to this legal environment. Rather than risk using false weights, many traders invested heavily in precision measuring devices, creating a thriving industry in high-quality scales and weights that were often more accurate than their users needed for honest business. Better to overinvest in measurement precision than underinvest in finger retention, as the saying probably went. This created an interesting economic paradox where the harshest punishments actually improved overall business practices. Merchants became obsessively honest about measurements, leading to increased consumer confidence and expanded trade relationships. Terror, it turns out, can be an effective quality control mechanism, though probably not one that modern business schools would recommend. The finger amputation system also created an unexpected form of professional insurance. Successful merchants often employed dedicated measurers, people whose only job was to handle weights and scales, essentially human quality control specialists whose fingers were on the line for every transaction. These weren't slaves or servants, but skilled professionals who commanded high wages for taking on the physical risk of measurement accuracy. The marketplace grows more crowded as you move toward the textile quarter, where the complexity of Sumerian commercial law reaches levels that would challenge modern regulatory agencies. Here, among the colorful fabrics and spinning wheels, you encounter the guild system that controlled wool and linen trade through membership requirements. So bizarre they seem designed by someone with a peculiar sense of humor and an obsession with proving dedication through suffering. The mainstream historical reality is that Sumerian textile production was one of the ancient world's most sophisticated industries, involving complex supply chains that stretched from sheep pastures to royal wardrobes. The quality control standards were remarkably high, with different grades of wool and linen that required expert knowledge to produce and evaluate. Guild membership wasn't just about professional networking. It was about maintaining the technical expertise that kept Sumerian textiles competitive in international markets where reputation meant everything. Here's where the guild rules get wonderfully weird. Prospective textile merchants had to demonstrate their commitment by completing what can only be described as endurance challenges that tested their dedication to fabric in ways that seem completely unrelated to actual business skills. One requirement involved staying awake for 3 consecutive days while continuously spinning thread, not because sleep-deprived spinning produced better results, but because it proved you cared enough about textiles to sacrifice your sanity for them. But the truly quirky detail that makes historians scratch their heads involves the wool oath, which required new guild members to sleep on raw, unwashed sheep's wool for an entire month, developing an intimate familiarity with their product that went far beyond professional necessity. The logic was that a true textile merchant should be able to assess wool quality through smell, texture, and even the sounds it made when compressed. This created a generation of wool experts with sensory skills that bordered on supernatural, but also probably made them rather unpleasant dinner companions. You watch as a young merchant attempts the guild's spinning endurance test, his eyes red with exhaustion as he maintains the steady rhythm that's kept his thread production consistent for the past 60 hours. Guild masters observe with the intensity of Olympic judges, looking for any sign that sleep deprivation is affecting his technique. This isn't hazing, this is professional certification, with stakes that could determine his entire career trajectory in the textile trade. Historians still argue whether these extreme membership requirements were practical training methods or elaborate rituals designed to limit guild membership and maintain high prices through artificial scarcity. The evidence suggests both motivations were at work, creating a system that produced genuinely skilled merchants while also restricting competition through barriers that had nothing to do with actual commercial ability. The guild system also created fascinating specializations within the textile trade. Some merchants focused exclusively on wool from sheep that grazed in specific regions, developing expertise so narrow they could identify the origin of fleece by examining a single thread. Others specialized in particular dyeing techniques, becoming artists as much as merchants, whose color combinations were closely guarded trade secrets passed down through generations. Foreign merchants trying to break into Sumerian textile markets faced the challenge of either completing these bizarre membership requirements or finding local partners willing to sponsor their entry into the guild system. This created a thriving business in guild sponsorship, where established merchants would essentially rent out their membership credentials to outsiders in exchange for profit-sharing agreements that could last for decades. The wool sleeping requirement led to an unexpected side effect. Guild members developed remarkable abilities to detect textile quality flaws that others missed entirely. A merchant who'd spent a month sleeping on raw wool could spot inferior fleece processing from across a crowded marketplace, giving guild members genuine competitive advantages that justified their exclusive status beyond simple market manipulation. As afternoon approaches and the marketplace reaches its busiest period, you encounter perhaps the most terrifying job in all of ancient Sumer: grain storage guard. These weren't simple security guards watching over warehouses. These were men and women who lived under permanent death sentences, where a single missing bushel of barley could result in execution, and where the difference between honest oversight and criminal negligence was measured in handfuls of grain. The mainstream historical fact is that grain storage was the backbone of Sumerian civilization's survival strategy. In a region where floods and droughts could destroy entire harvests, the massive granaries represented the difference between prosperity and famine for entire city-states. The guards weren't just protecting commodities, they were safeguarding the survival of thousands of people, which explains why the legal system treated grain theft as seriously as treason or murder. Here's where the job requirements get absolutely brutal. Grain guards were held personally responsible for every single grain that entered or left their assigned storage areas, with accounting systems so detailed they would impress modern inventory specialists. Each guard maintained personal cuneiform tablets recording not just quantities, but also quality assessments, storage location within the granary, and projected shelf life based on seasonal conditions. Get the math wrong, and you might literally lose your head over a clerical error. But the truly mind-bending aspect was the collective responsibility system. Guards worked in teams, but if one member stole grain, the entire team faced execution unless they could prove they'd actively tried to prevent the theft. This created a surveillance culture within the surveillance profession, where grain guards spent as much time watching each other as they did protecting the stored crops. Imagine trying to steal a snack from your office kitchen, knowing that your coworkers would be executed if you got caught. You observe a changing of the guard ceremony that resembles a military operation more than a simple shift change. The outgoing guards must account for every container, every sealed storage room, and every tool used in grain management. The incoming team verifies each count independently, with both groups signing cuneiform contracts that legally bind them to the accuracy of their inventory reports. One miscounted jar could doom them all. Historians still argue whether these extreme measures were necessary for preventing famine, or if they represent ancient bureaucracy run completely amok. But the results speak for themselves. Sumerian granaries maintained remarkably low theft rates and high-quality storage standards that kept grain edible for years when properly managed. Fear, it turns out, can be an extremely effective management tool, though probably not one recommended for for modern workplace environments. Psychological pressure of the job created interesting behavioral adaptations among grain guards. Many developed obsessive-compulsive tendencies that served them well professionally, but made them rather difficult to live with personally. There are tablets describing guards who counted household items obsessively, weighed their family's food portions to ensure perfect equality, and insisted on detailed written records for every domestic transaction, essentially bringing their professional paranoia home with them. The collective responsibility system also fostered unprecedented cooperation among people who might otherwise have been competitors or enemies. Guards shared techniques for detecting grain spoilage, methods for pest control, and strategies for maintaining accurate counts under difficult conditions. The threat of group execution created bonds of professional solidarity that transcended normal social divisions. Some guards became genuine experts in grain science, developing preservation techniques and quality assessment methods that were passed down through generations of storage specialists. The death penalty for grain theft accidentally created some of the ancient world's most knowledgeable agricultural scientists, though they probably would have preferred less life-threatening motivations for their expertise. The afternoon sun casts long shadows across the marketplace as you discover one of the most mathematically beautiful aspects of Sumerian commercial law: the sacred geometry that determined trading zones and market boundaries. This wasn't arbitrary city planning. This was cosmic order imposed on commercial chaos, where the positions of stalls, the flow of foot traffic, and even the placement of waste disposal areas were calculated according to religious principles that treated the marketplace as a living temple. The mainstream historical fact is that Sumerian cities were planned according to sophisticated mathematical principles that incorporated both practical urban management and religious symbolism. The marketplace wasn't just a convenient gathering place for commerce. It was a sacred space where the earthly activity of trade was harmonized with divine order through geometric arrangements that reflected cosmic patterns. Modern urban planners, with all their computer modeling and traffic flow analysis, might be impressed by the sophistication of these ancient designs. Here's where it gets beautifully weird. Livestock markets were positioned according to astronomical calculations that ensured certain types of animals were always sold in areas that received optimal sunlight during their designated trading hours. Cattle had to be sold in zones that aligned with specific constellations, while sheep and goats occupied areas calculated to harmonize with lunar cycles. This wasn't just religious symbolism. It was applied astronomy that treated animal commerce as part of a larger cosmic order. But the truly fascinating detail involves the geometric relationships between different merchant stalls. The distances between competing vendors weren't determined by simple space availability or traffic flow considerations. They were calculated according to mathematical ratios that were believed to prevent commercial conflicts through harmonic spacing. Merchants selling similar goods had to maintain specific geometric relationships that supposedly channeled competitive energies into productive rather than destructive patterns. You watch as a new merchant attempts to set up his stall, only to be redirected by market officials, consulting clay tablets covered with geometric diagrams and astronomical calculations. His desired location might be convenient and visible, but it violates the sacred spacing requirements that maintain market harmony. He's learning that successful commerce in Sumer requires understanding mathematics as much as merchandise. Historians still argue whether these geometric requirements were sophisticated crowd control measures disguised as religious practice, or genuine attempts to create marketplaces that functioned as earthly representations of cosmic order. The evidence suggests both motivations were at work, creating trading environments that were both practically efficient and spiritually satisfying for people who viewed commerce as a form of divine participation. The sacred geometry system created unexpected benefits for market management. The calculated spacing between stalls improved fire safety, reduced congestion during busy periods, and created natural gathering areas where informal negotiations could take place without disrupting main traffic flows. Ancient religious requirements accidentally produced some remarkably sensible urban planning solutions. Foreign merchants often hired local geometric consultants, specialists who understood the mathematical requirements for optimal stall placement and could navigate the complex approval process for market entry. These weren't just administrative helpers. They were applied mathematicians whose calculations could determine whether a merchant's business succeeded or failed based purely on spatial positioning. The astronomical alignment requirements also meant that certain types of commerce were only permitted during specific seasons or times of day, creating a complex scheduling system that modern event planners would find challenging to manage. A merchant selling sacred objects might only be allowed to trade during dawn hours when particular stars were visible, while livestock sales had to conclude before sunset during certain lunar phases. This temporal regulation created interesting economic dynamics where some merchants specialized in products that could only be sold during narrow time windows, commanding premium prices for their ability to navigate the complex scheduling requirements. Others became experts in rapid setup and breakdown, maximizing profits during brief trading periods allowed by astronomical calculations. As evening approaches and the marketplace begins its transition toward closure, you encounter what might be the most progressive aspect of ancient Sumerian commercial law: female merchant property rights that would make modern feminists nod with approval, while simultaneously wondering how ancient Mesopotamia managed to be more enlightened about women's economic independence than many societies thousands of years later. The mainstream historical fact is that Sumerian women enjoyed legal and economic rights that were remarkably advanced for their time, including the ability to own property, conduct business independently, and inherit commercial enterprises from their families. This wasn't token equality. This was full participation in economic life, with wealthy merchant women controlling entire market districts and commanding the same respect as their male counterparts. Some of the most successful international trading operations were run by women who built commercial empires that spanned continents. Here's where it gets wonderfully progressive. Married women retained complete control over their personal commercial activities, meaning a husband couldn't interfere with his wife's business decisions or claim ownership of profits she earned through her own merchant activities. This created some fascinating household dynamics where couples might be competitors in the marketplace during the day while sharing domestic responsibilities in the evening, leading to dinner conversations that probably mixed marital gossip with commodity price analysis. But the truly remarkable aspect was the inheritance system that allowed merchant families to pass businesses to daughters as easily as sons, with no legal distinction based on gender. This created powerful commercial dynasties where women inherited not just property, but also established trade relationships, customer networks, and specialized knowledge that had been developed over generations. Some of the most prestigious merchant houses were matriarchal enterprises, where women made the major business decisions, while their husbands managed subsidiary operations. You observe as an elegantly dressed woman conducts what appears to be a major business negotiation, surrounded by male merchants who treat her with the same deference they would show any powerful trader. Her clay tablets record transactions involving hundreds of silver pieces, and her personal seal, the ancient equivalent of a business signature, carries the same legal authority as any male merchant's. This isn't unusual or progressive for its time. This is simply how business works in Sumerian society. Historians still argue whether these female property rights developed out of practical necessity in a trading culture or represented genuinely progressive social attitudes. But the legal tablets are clear. Women were full participants in commercial life, with rights that many societies wouldn't recognize for thousands of years. The evidence suggests that economic success created social equality rather than the other way around. The female merchant networks created interesting business dynamics that often gave women advantages in certain types of trade. Women traders developed strong relationships with female customers, particularly in luxury goods and household items, creating market segments where female merchants had natural competitive advantages. These weren't limited markets. Either luxury trade was incredibly profitable and connected to international commerce networks. Some women became specialists in products that required detailed knowledge of household management, textile production, or food preparation, areas where their personal experience translated into commercial expertise. But others succeeded in traditionally male-dominated areas like livestock trading or metal commerce, proving that their success wasn't limited to stereotypically feminine products. The legal protection for female merchant activities also created interesting marriage contracts where couples negotiated business territories and profit-sharing arrangements as part of their wedding agreements. Some marriages were essentially business partnerships with romantic components, while others maintained completely separate commercial identities despite sharing household responsibilities. Foreign merchants often found that establishing relationships with successful Sumerian businesswomen provided access to customer networks and trade relationships that male merchants couldn't easily penetrate. This created a form of commercial diplomacy where women traders served as bridges between different cultural and economic systems. The marketplace grows quieter as merchants begin their evening settlements, but you're about to encounter one of the most legally complex and morally ambiguous aspects of Sumerian commerce. The debt slavery system, with its intricate loopholes that allowed clever negotiators to manipulate what should have been straightforward bondage arrangements into temporary freedom strategies that would impress modern contract lawyers with their sophistication. The mainstream historical fact is that debt slavery was a common legal institution throughout ancient Mesopotamia, serving as both a method of debt collection and a social safety net for people facing economic catastrophe. When someone couldn't repay loans, they or their family members could be legally enslaved to work off the debt. But this wasn't permanent chattel slavery. It was a contractual arrangement with specific terms, time limits, and legal protections that distinguished it from other forms of bondage. Here's where the system gets cleverly subversive. Experienced debtors learned to structure their loan agreements with escape clauses that technically fulfilled slavery requirements while providing opportunities for early release through alternative payments, substitute labor, or even successful legal challenges based on contractual technicalities. Some people became expert contract negotiators who could navigate debt slavery arrangements in ways that minimized actual bondage time while satisfying creditors' legal requirements. But the truly fascinating loophole involved family substitution agreements, where debt slaves could arrange for relatives to serve portions of their bondage terms, creating complex rotation systems where individual family members might serve a few months each, rather than one person serving several years. This required sophisticated scheduling and legal documentation, but it allowed families to maintain some economic independence while still satisfying debt obligations through shared sacrifice. You watch as a debt negotiation takes place near one of the market's official record-keeping stations, with both parties consulting multiple clay tablets while a scribe documents every detail of their agreement. What appears to be a straightforward debt slavery arrangement is actually a complex legal document that includes provisions for early release, alternative payment methods, and family substitution options that transform potential years of bondage into a manageable temporary hardship. Historians still argue whether these loopholes represented humane modifications to harsh legal systems, or simply reflected the complexity of commercial relationships in a society where personal and business finances were deeply intertwined. The evidence suggests both interpretations are valid, The system was designed to collect debts while acknowledging the social costs of removing productive citizens from normal economic participation. The temporary nature of debt slavery created interesting economic incentives where creditors had motivation to help their bondservants develop skills that would enable them to repay debts more quickly. Some debt slaves received training in specialized crafts or business methods that made them more valuable as free citizens than as permanent bondservants, creating a perverse form of economic education program funded through legal bondage. Smart debtors sometimes used slavery periods strategically, arranging to serve wealthy merchants who could provide business connections, skill training, or even investment opportunities that would improve their economic prospects after release. This transformed debt slavery from simple punishment into a potentially beneficial networking opportunity for people with enough foresight to manipulate the system cleverly. The legal complexity of these arrangements created a specialty profession of debt negotiators, people who understood the intricacies of slavery law and could structure agreements that protected both creditors' interests and debtors' long-term welfare. These weren't just legal advisors, they were strategic planners who could turn financial disasters into manageable temporary setbacks. Some families developed multi-generational strategies for managing debt obligations, where younger members would accept slavery terms that older relatives had negotiated decades earlier, creating long-term financial planning that spanned multiple lifetimes while technically satisfying ancient legal requirements through creative interpretations of contractual language. As the evening market activities wind down and foreign merchants prepare for another night in this strange but profitable city, you witness the elaborate bureaucratic maze that controlled international commerce through residency requirements so complex they would challenge modern immigration lawyers, while simultaneously creating opportunities for clever entrepreneurs who understood how to navigate the system profitably. The mainstream historical fact is that Sumerian cities attracted merchants from across the ancient world, creating cosmopolitan trading centers where dozens of languages and cultural traditions intersected in pursuit of commercial success. However, foreign traders couldn't simply arrive and begin conducting business. They had to navigate complex legal requirements that balanced the city's need for international commerce with concerns about maintaining local economic control and cultural integrity. Here's where the system gets bureaucratically beautiful. Foreign merchants had to obtain multiple forms of legal recognition, including trade permits, residency documentation, religious participation certificates, and sponsor endorsements from established local merchants. Each requirement involved separate application processes, fees, waiting periods, and renewal procedures that could take months to complete properly. The system was designed to ensure that only seriously committed foreign traders would invest the time and resources necessary to establish permanent business relationships. But as you settle into your evening observations, your attention shifts to to a different kind of commerce entirely, one that operated within the sacred walls of Inanna's temple, where religious devotion and economic transaction merged in ways that would make modern regulatory agencies weep into their compliance manuals. The temple courtyard buzzes with an energy that's part spiritual sanctuary, part high-end boutique, and entirely Sumerian in its matter-of-fact approach to mixing the sacred with the profitable. The mainstream historical fact is that temple prostitution, or sacred prostitution, as scholars prefer to call it, was a legitimate religious and economic institution in ancient Mesopotamian society. These weren't back-alley transactions, but carefully regulated spiritual services performed by temple personnel who held respected positions within the religious hierarchy. The practice served multiple functions: honoring fertility deities, generating revenue for temple operations, and providing structured opportunities for spiritual communion that transcended ordinary social boundaries. You watch as elegantly dressed priestesses conduct their evening rituals, their movements choreographed with the precision of a business meeting and the reverence of a prayer service. These women aren't desperate outcasts, but educated professionals who can read cuneiform, manage complex financial arrangements, and navigate the intricate religious protocols that govern their sacred work. They're essentially running a spiritual service industry that would make modern hospitality consultants nod in professional appreciation. The pricing structure alone demonstrates the sophisticated economic thinking behind this institution. Different categories of service commanded different fees, calculated not just on duration or specific acts, but on the spiritual significance of the ritual, the religious calendar, and the social status of both participants. Premium rates applied during fertility festivals, while standard pricing covered routine spiritual consultations. It's like surge pricing, but with divine blessing included in the base package. Here's the quirky detail that makes this system particularly fascinating. Temple prostitutes were often temporary positions held by ordinary citizens fulfilling religious obligations rather than career professionals. Young women from respectable families might serve for specified periods as part of their spiritual education, creating a rotation system that democratized both the religious experience and the economic benefits. It's community service with benefits, literally. The legal protections surrounding this profession were remarkably progressive for their time. Temple prostitutes enjoyed legal rights and protections that exceeded those of many other working women, including the right to own property, conduct business independently, and receive temple support for their children. The law specified that clients who refused to pay, who behaved violently, or who attempted to coerce additional services faced serious penalties, including fines, public humiliation, and banishment from temple grounds. But the truly ingenious aspect was how this system integrated with the broader Sumerian economy. Temple prostitution wasn't isolated from mainstream commerce, but connected to it through complex networks of taxation, regulation, and economic support. The temples functioned as economic institutions that generated revenue, employed workers, and invested in community development projects. Sacred commerce supported secular prosperity in ways that created lasting economic benefits for entire city-states. You observe the careful protocols that govern client interactions, from the initial consultation process to the completion of spiritual services. Everything follows established procedures designed to protect both parties while ensuring that religious objectives remain primary. Clients must demonstrate proper respect for the sacred nature of their participation, while service providers maintain professional boundaries that preserve the spiritual integrity of their work. Historians still argue whether temple prostitution represented women's economic empowerment or religious exploitation, with evidence supporting both interpretations depending on which aspects of the system you examine. The legal protections and economic independence suggest empowerment, while the religious obligations and social constraints indicate potential exploitation. The truth probably lies somewhere between these extremes, reflecting the complex realities of ancient societies where religious, economic, and social systems intertwined in ways that resist simple moral categorization. The documentation surrounding this institution reveals surprisingly modern concerns about worker safety, customer satisfaction, and quality control. Temple records include complaints procedures, performance evaluations, and disciplinary measures that address both professional and spiritual misconduct. It's human resources management with divine oversight, creating accountability systems that protected both workers and the institution's reputation. Some of the most successful temples developed reputations for excellence that attracted clients from distant cities, creating religious tourism industries that boosted local economies. These institutions competed for customers through superior service, beautiful facilities, and spiritual experiences that satisfied both religious and personal needs. It's hospitality industry competition in ancient Mesopotamian form. The agricultural laws that governed Sumerian farming communities created a justice system so intimately connected to natural cycles that modern environmentalists would weep with joy at its organic integration of human behavior with seasonal rhythms, while criminal justice reformers would marvel at rehabilitation programs that literally grew from the ground up. Remember those temple prostitutes who enjoyed such sophisticated legal protections? Well, farmers operated under equally complex but entirely different legal frameworks that tied their professional obligations to cosmic forces beyond human control. Agricultural contracts weren't just business agreements, but sacred covenants that acknowledged humanity's dependence on divine favor, seasonal timing, and the cooperation of forces that could destroy entire communities through drought, flood, or pestilence. Mainstream historical fact is that Sumerian agricultural law recognized the inherent unpredictability of farming, by creating flexible legal structures that adjusted punishments, obligations, and rewards based on actual harvest outcomes rather than theoretical projections. This wasn't primitive thinking, but sophisticated risk management that distributed the uncertainties of agricultural production across entire communities rather than concentrating them on individual farmers. Here's where the system becomes beautifully organic. Criminal sentences for agricultural crimes were literally tied to crop cycles, with punishment severity adjusted based on harvest success or failure. A farmer convicted of irrigation fraud during an abundant harvest year faced heavier penalties than one convicted of the same crime during drought conditions. The law recognized that desperation created different moral contexts that required different judicial responses. You witness the autumn harvest tribunals, where agricultural disputes receive final resolution after months of growing season uncertainty. Farmers accused of seed theft, irrigation violations, or contract breaches wait anxiously as temple officials calculate not just the legal implications of their actions, but the agricultural outcomes that determine their punishment severity. It's criminal justice with seasonal adjustment factors built into the sentencing guidelines. The quirky detail that makes this system particularly fascinating is how harvest festivals doubled as criminal justice events, where prisoner releases were determined by crop success. Abundant harvests meant generous pardons and reduced sentences, while poor harvests resulted in extended punishments and additional community service obligations. The logic was that prosperous communities could afford mercy, while struggling ones needed every available worker to survive lean periods. But the ingenuity goes deeper than simple seasonal adjustments. Agricultural contracts included weather clauses that automatically modified obligations based on rainfall measurements, flood levels, and other environmental factors beyond human control. Farmers weren't held responsible for failures caused by natural disasters, but they also couldn't claim full credit for successes that resulted from unusually favorable conditions. Its force majeure provisions, with divine intervention, explicitly factored into the legal calculations. The sharecropping arrangements that dominated Sumerian agriculture created complex webs of mutual obligation that extended far beyond simple landlord-tenant relationships. Landowners provided seeds, tools, and oxen, while farmers contributed labor and expertise, with harvest shares determined by formulas that considered not just productivity, but the relative contributions of natural fertility, human effort, and divine blessing. Both parties shared risks and rewards in proportions that reflected the collaborative nature of successful agriculture. Historians still argue whether these seasonal justice systems represented sophisticated understanding of agricultural economics or primitive superstition that confused natural phenomena with moral causation. The evidence suggests both elements were present, creating legal frameworks that combined practical risk management with religious worldviews that saw human behavior and natural forces as fundamentally interconnected. The documentation of these agricultural courts reveals surprisingly detailed record keeping that tracked not just legal proceedings, but weather patterns, crop yields, and economic outcomes across multiple growing seasons. Temple scribes maintained databases that would impress modern agricultural economists, correlating legal decisions with long-term productivity trends to evaluate the effectiveness of different judicial approaches. Some of the most interesting cases involved multi-year contracts that created ongoing relationships between parties who had to navigate changing conditions together. A farmer who failed to meet contract obligations during a drought year might receive extensions and support, but those accommodations created additional obligations during subsequent abundant harvests. It's agricultural finance with built-in mutual assistance provisions. The seasonal sentence system also created rehabilitation programs that connected criminal punishment with productive work. Offenders sentenced to agricultural labor during planting season received training in farming techniques while contributing to community food production. By harvest time, many had developed skills and relationships that supported successful reintegration into agricultural society. The gradual decline of Hammurabi's elaborate market laws began not with dramatic conquest or revolutionary change, but through the slow erosion that comes when complex systems meet simpler realities, like watching an intricate sandcastle gradually surrendering to patient waves that respect neither architectural ambition nor the builder's careful intentions. Remember those seasonal justice systems that tied criminal punishment to harvest cycles. Those represented the pinnacle of Sumerian legal sophistication, but they also contained the seeds of their own obsolescence. As Babylon's power expanded beyond agricultural city-states into diverse territories with different climates, economies, and cultural traditions, the intimate connection between local conditions and legal outcomes became increasingly impractical to maintain. The mainstream historical fact is that Hammurabi's code influenced legal development throughout the ancient world, with elements appearing in subsequent law codes across multiple civilizations for over a millennium. However, the specific market regulations that governed Sumerian commercial life gradually disappeared as trade networks expanded, political structures changed, and new economic systems emerged that required different legal frameworks. You observe the twilight proceedings of what may be the last traditional market tribunal, where elderly judges struggle to apply ancient precedents to commercial disputes that involve trading relationships spanning multiple kingdoms, currencies that fluctuate based on distant political events, and merchants who owe allegiance to rulers who've never heard of Hammurabi's sacred principles. The old certainties are dissolving into the complexities of an interconnected world that operates on scales the original lawmakers never imagined. Here's the quirky detail that makes this transition particularly poignant. Some of the most cherished Sumerian legal traditions survived longest not in formal law codes, but in the informal customs of merchant communities who carried traditional business practices to distant lands where they mixed with local traditions to create hybrid commercial cultures. The spirit of Sumerian market law lived on in handshake agreements and traditional business relationships long after the formal legal structures had been replaced by simpler, more broadly applicable regulations. Alewives who once faced drowning for watering down beer now operate under basic fraud statutes that lack the colorful specificity of earlier regulations. The temple prostitutes, who enjoyed such detailed legal protections, find their profession increasingly marginalized as new religious traditions reshape social attitudes toward sacred commerce. The farmers whose sentences fluctuated with harvest outcomes now face standardized punishments that ignore seasonal variations and environmental factors. But the influence of these ancient legal innovations persists in unexpected ways throughout modern legal systems. Contract law still recognizes principles of mutual obligation that echo Sumerian agricultural agreements. Consumer protection regulations reflect the same concerns about fair dealing that motivated those harsh punishments for false weights and measures. Employment law incorporates ideas about worker protection that first appeared in regulations governing craft guilds and professional associations. Historians still argue whether the decline of Hammurabi's code represented legal progress toward more universal principles of justice, or the loss of sophisticated systems that better reflected the complex realities of ancient economic life. The evidence suggests both processes were occurring simultaneously as legal systems evolved to serve larger, more diverse populations while losing some of the nuanced responsiveness that characterized earlier, more localized approaches to justice. The archaeological record reveals the gradual simplification of legal procedures as administrative efficiency became more important than procedural completeness. Court records become shorter and more formulaic, suggesting that judges were processing cases more quickly, but with less attention to the specific circumstances that earlier legal traditions had considered essential to fair judgment. Some remote communities continued applying traditional Sumerian legal principles long after they'd been officially replaced, creating legal pluralism that allowed different communities to maintain their preferred approaches to justice while nominally accepting imperial authority. These legal refuges preserved ancient wisdom that might otherwise have been lost entirely. As you drift away from these ancient marketplaces, the sounds of haggling merchants and creaking cart wheels gradually fade into the gentle murmur of distant memory, carrying with them the echoes of laws so strange and specific that they seem almost dreamlike in their elaborate attention to the smallest details of daily life. The weight of those sacred scales dissolves into the softness of evening air, while the stern voices of ancient judges blend with the whisper of wind through ruins that once bustled with the urgent business of buying and selling, loving and arguing, building and creating the foundations of everything we know about justice and commerce, and the delicate balance between order and chaos. You can almost feel the warm dust of Sumerian streets beneath your feet growing cool as night falls across civilizations that have slept for millennia, their laws and customs and curious regulations settling into the peaceful silence of well-earned rest, leaving behind only the gentle lesson that human beings have always struggled with the same fundamental questions about fairness and community, and how to live together without destroying each other. The last echoes of those ancient marketplaces fade into the rhythm of your own breathing, slow and steady and reassuring, carrying you gently away from the fascinating complexities of laws written in stone and clay toward the simple comfort of knowing that somewhere in the long sweep of human history, people cared enough about justice to write it down in all its beautiful, ridiculous, utterly human detail. Sleep well, knowing that the ancient dreams of fairness still echo softly through the laws that shape our modern world, patient and enduring as the stars that watched over those first marketplaces where civilization learned to count and measure and weigh the value of everything under heaven